So we talked about defining poverty both conceptually and technically, and then how it is that we define and measure poverty in the United States. So, since we know that and we know some of the criticisms of how we measure poverty, let's actually look at who is poor in America. All of these statistics come from the Census Bureau, either from the decennial census or from the Current Population Survey, the CPS, which is the product that the census puts out to measure American demographic information between censuses. Okay, so that way, that's how we get updated information between those census years. Of course, census years are every 10 years. All of these statistics are current to 2017, unless otherwise specified. Okay? So I'm going to put some links to these data on Moodle, so if you want to play around with it or look for some stuff that I don't present here, you're welcome to do that. So remember that the poverty line is essentially an income measure, right? So if you're below that income, you're poor. If you're above that income, you're not poor. So let's look at income, right? That's the natural place to start. We look at median household income, because if we were to use average or mean household income, it would be skewed, right? It would be pulled way up because of Bill Gates and Elon Musk, and it would be pulled way down by people who are at zero, right? In other words, they're not pulling in any income. So this particular graph looks at median household income by race and ethnicity. And you can see there's some trend lines here if you're interested in kind of historical trends. But for the end of 2017, median household income in the United States, right, this is the purple line here, was $61,372. Okay. And then you can see there are significant differences by race. Black Americans have the lowest median household income at just over $40,000. Hispanic Americans are at $50,486 for median household income. White Americans just over $68,000, and Asian Americans just at around $81,000 of median household income. So, knowing that, where are we with regards to poverty? At the end of 2017, not 1917, at the end of 2017, the poverty rate in the United States was 12.3%. So 12.3% of Americans lived below the federal poverty line. That's almost 40 million people. Okay? So that is the official poverty threshold, the official poverty line measurement. If we were to look at instead the supplemental poverty measurement, right, it's going to give poverty rates for the total population and by age. We're interested in the orange bar of 2017, and you can see it is slightly higher, right? So whereas the official poverty measure that the U.S. government uses for demographic purposes, it says 12.3% of Americans were in poverty at the end of 2017. The census's supplemental poverty measure says it's a little more than that, right? It's almost 14% of Americans. How do those compare? The Census Bureau does a nice job of displaying this information. So you can see across a variety of categories how these two poverty measures differ. And you can see that the supplemental poverty measure does typically report higher rates of poverty than the traditional measure does. There are some exceptions, right? In the case of household type cohabiting partners, so these are people who live together but they're not married, that may mean that they are partners. That may mean that they are just unmarried partners, either same-sex or opposite-sex partners. It could be that there's some other unique cohabiting situation, but they have reported themselves as partners. So the poverty measure, the official poverty measure in the United States, says that 25.1% of those households are in poverty, the supplemental poverty measure says, no, that's way too high. It's really just 13.3%. On the other side of the scale, right, let's look at Asian Americans, right? According to the official poverty measure, only 10% of Asian Americans, roughly, were considered living below the poverty line, right? So a rate of 10%. The supplemental poverty measure says, no, you're actually underestimating the percentage of Asian Americans that are poor. It's actually 15.1%, so that's a 5.1% difference, right? So you can see kind of the differences in these poverty rates and these poverty measures. So let's continue to look on at some of these categories, and we're going to look at the official measure from here on out, not the SPM. So let's look at age, right? And here we want to look at differences between groups, right? So between groups of Americans, what do poverty rates look like? For those age 65 and older, this is this peach line here. About 9.2% of elderly Americans live below the poverty line. Notice that that has gone down significantly over time. That is because right around in here is the introduction and implementation of Medicare, right? So that means that declining healthcare costs meant that fewer elderly people were below the poverty line, right? Because they didn't have to spend as much of their income on healthcare, and because of reforms to some pension and Social Security rules as well, right? American adults have a relatively stable poverty rate, although it has increased since the 1980s. You see it kind of has gone up and then it's kind of leveled out a little bit with some peaks and valleys. Notably, of course, during recessionary periods, so these darker bars, income's going to, poverty rates are going to change, right? But American adults, age 18 to 64, have an 11.2% poverty rate. So 11.2% of American adults age 18 to 64 live below the poverty line. And of course, the highest poverty rate is always among children. American children under the age of 18 have a 17.5% poverty rate. You'll find that over time, at least since the correction for the elderly in the 1960s, that's been consistent. Children are the poorest age group in America. So let's look at some within group differences, right? So we might not be interested just in between group differences, but we also might want to see some differences within particular groups. So again, we're looking at age, but here we're going to break it out within each group by sex, right? The first thing you're going to notice is that women have higher poverty rates in every age group. The most pronounced differences are among the elderly and among American adults, right? Age 18 to 64. Of the 9.2% of elderly Americans that are poor, right? We want to look within that category, right? It's 10.5% for elderly females and only 7.5% for elderly males, right? For adults, it's 13% poverty rates for women adults or female adults and 9.4% for male, right? These differences are pretty explainable. And if we were in class, again, I would stop and ask you, why is this difference present? And you would say things like the wage gap for men and women, the income equality gap for men and women. Women cycle in and out of the workforce more often because they take leave to have kids or to care for elderly parents or to care for kids. So they may experience some penalties there. For older Americans, obviously, a lot of those women who are elderly now, age 65 and older now, may not have spent as much time in the workforce as women do in my generation or your generation. So they didn't build up enough Social Security or as much Social Security or pension income. So those would explain some of those differences. We can also break this out by race and ethnicity, right? I should have just axed this we're really interested in these 4 categories. Non-Hispanic whites, so white Americans, Black Americans, Asian Americans, and Hispanic Americans. The poverty rate among white Americans is 8.7%. The highest rates are among Black Americans and Hispanic Americans at 21.2% and 18.3% respectively. And then Asian Americans, as you saw in a previous chart, have a 10% poverty rate, right? This is pretty consistent as far as over time. It may go up or down a little bit, but these comparisons are pretty consistent. Typically, Black Americans and Hispanic Americans have higher poverty rates than white Americans or Asian Americans. I'm going to come back to that in just a minute because I want to show you a different way to break down this data. So we might be interested in these differences in each group, right? But we also may want to see as a total percentage of all people, all Americans in poverty. Of all Americans in poverty, 60.5% of them are white. That makes sense given that white Americans still make up the majority of the population, right? So you would expect them to make up a higher proportion of the poor in America. 18.3% of Americans are Hispanic, 13.2% of Americans who are poor are Black, and 6% of poor Americans are Asian, right? So just note these differences in how you present data. If you're interested in poverty among one single group, this is the measure you're going to want to use. If you're interested in comparing poverty between groups in the United States, this is what you want to use, right? So just note that you can present data in very different ways. We can also look at poverty by family status, right? So on the left here, we're looking at the type of family. Married couple families have about a 5% poverty rate. Single parent households have much higher poverty rates. Single parent households headed by women have a significant poverty rate. 1 in 4 single parent households headed by women live in poverty. That number is, or that percentage is about half that for single parent families where the man is the head of household. In other words, single dad, no wife present. Okay. So again, this is showing what we kind of already saw in a previous graph. Women tend to have higher poverty rates than men. In this case, it's also transmitting that status to their children. On the right here, we see what we call the lone wolves, right? The lone wolves, I guess. These are our single folks. 23.2% of single women in the United States are poor, or live below the poverty line. 18.2% of men, single men in America, live below the poverty line. We can also look by region. This won't be surprising to you. The South has the highest poverty rate among regions in the United States. The Northeast and the Midwest typically trend around the same percentage, and in 2017 they were exactly the same. And then the West is usually just a little bit higher than the Northeast and the Midwest. This is a pretty stable trend. The South typically is the poorest region and has been for quite some time. Now, the poverty rate in the South has come down a little bit, but it's still higher than the other regions. Of course, we want to look by education. I think this is the clearest graph you could possibly see. Poverty rates go down as education goes up, right? And look how nice and neat and clean that comparison is. Individuals who don't have a high school diploma in this country have almost a 25% poverty rate. Those who completed high school but did not attend college, half that. Look, just completing high school changes that trajectory significantly. It goes down even more. Those who have some college but didn't get a degree have an 8.8% poverty rate. And then those who did get a college degree or more than that, so they have some professional degree or graduate degree, have around a 5% poverty rate. And then work status. And I'm about to run out of time in my self-imposed timeline, so I'm going to hold work status for a second. But that's good because it's going to help us launch into the next section anyway. So stay tuned for that. And we'll look at that in part 4.